Hi, I'm Sherlock. Welcome to my new mystery case.
The bitter winds of February 1894 had transformed London into a crystalline fortress where even the Thames bore a skin of ice along its edges, and the very air seemed to fracture with each breath. It was upon such a morning, when the mercury had not risen above freezing for a fortnight, that I found myself in our familiar lodgings at 221B Baker Street, grateful for the robust fire crackling in our hearth. Holmes sat in his customary chair, his sharp profile etched against the dancing flames as he examined a peculiar chemical specimen through his magnifying glass. The tranquillity of our morning was shattered by the urgent clamour of boots upon our stairs, followed by Mrs. Hudson's apologetic voice announcing Inspector Lestrade. The little Scotland Yard detective burst into our sitting-room without ceremony, his face flushed with cold, and what I recognized as professional bewilderment of the most acute variety. "Holmes!" he gasped, dispensing with all pleasantries. "Thank Providence you're here. We've a case that defies every law of nature and reason. I've been at it since dawn, and I confess myself utterly defeated." Holmes set down his glass with deliberate precision and fixed Lestrade with that penetrating gaze that could extract confessions from the most recalcitrant criminals. "Your breathing suggests rapid travel through bitter cold, Inspector. The ice crystals still clinging to your moustache indicate you've come directly from an outdoor scene. Yet your agitation speaks of something far more disturbing than mere exposure to the elements?" "Quite right, as always," Lestrade replied, removing his hat with trembling fingers. "It's Sir Reginald Blackwood, the shipping magnate. Found him dead in his private study at Grosvenor Square not 3 hours past. But Holmes—" He paused, struggling with the words. "The man was frozen solid as a block of ice, yet the room was warm as toast, with a roaring fire in the grate." I felt my medical training rebel against such an assertion. "Surely you must be mistaken, Inspector. The human body cannot freeze in warm conditions." "That's just it, Doctor," Lestrade interrupted, his voice rising with frustration. "When we broke down the door, for it was locked from the inside with the key in Sir Reginald's pocket, we found him seated at his desk, rigid with cold, frost glittering on his whiskers and eyebrows. But within minutes, before our very eyes, he began to thaw. Water pooled beneath his chair, his clothing grew damp, and the frost melted away as if he'd been placed before a furnace. Holmes had risen during this extraordinary recital, his tall frame coiled with that familiar tension that preceded his most brilliant deductions. "The study, Inspector. Describe it in detail." "Locked from within, as I said. Windows latched tight, no other means of entry. The fire had been burning all night, according to the butler, coal still glowing when we arrived. The room was stifling, Holmes, yet our victim appeared to have perished in the heart of an Arctic winter. His face bore that peculiar blue pallor of extreme cold. His limbs were rigid, and I swear I heard the crackling of ice in his clothing when we first approached the body." "And the thawing process?" Holmes inquired, his voice sharp with interest. "Rapid beyond all natural explanation. Within a quarter hour, the frost had vanished entirely, leaving only dampness and the unmistakable odour of melting ice. Dr. Pemberton, who attended the scene, declared it the most extraordinary phenomenon he had witnessed in 30 years of practice." Holmes began his characteristic pacing, his hands clasped behind his back, his brow furrowed in concentration. "You mentioned the door was locked from within. What of the key?" "Found it in Sir Reginald's waistcoat pocket, just as if he'd locked himself in for the evening's work. The butler, Henshaw, swears his master was alive and well when he brought brandy at 9:30. Found him at 7 this morning when he came to stoke the fire." "The household?" Holmes continued his interrogation with methodical precision. "Lady Blackwood is visiting her sister in Bath. Has been for a week. The staff consists of Henshaw the butler, Mrs. Cray, the cook, and 2 housemaids, all accounted for throughout the night. Sir Reginald's business partner, Mr. Aldrich Vance, dined with him yesterday evening, but departed before 10 o'clock. The secretary, young Pemberton, no relation to the doctor, left the house at 6, as is his custom. Holmes paused in his pacing, his grey eyes alight with that familiar fire that indicated a puzzle worthy of his extraordinary faculties. Inspector, you have presented us with an impossibility that challenges the very foundations of natural law. A man cannot freeze to death in a warm room, yet if he were frozen elsewhere and transported, the thawing process you describe would require conditions far exceeding those of even the most heated interior. Precisely my dilemma, Lestrade replied miserably. The physicians speak of some unknown poison that might simulate the effects of extreme cold, but they can offer no explanation for the ice, the frost, or the rapid thawing. It's as if Sir Reginald was plucked from the depths of winter and deposited in his study, only to be reclaimed by the natural warmth of the room. I found myself studying Holmes's face as he absorbed these details, watching the play of thought across his aquiline features. The case presented elements that seemed to mock the very principles of physics and medicine, yet I knew that behind his calm exterior, my friend's remarkable mind was already beginning to construct theories that might reconcile the impossible with the rationale. "Watson," Holmes said suddenly, turning to me with decision, "fetch your bag and warmest coat. Inspector Lestrade, we shall accompany you to Grosvenor Square immediately. If we are to solve the mystery of how a man freezes in a heated room and thaws too, soon, for nature's laws, we must examine the scene while the evidence remains fresh." As I gathered my medical equipment and winter garments, I could not suppress a thrill of anticipation. Here was a case that promised to test every faculty Holmes possessed, a puzzle that seemed to defy not merely criminal investigation, but the very laws of science itself. The corpse that thawed too soon had presented us with a challenge unlike any we had previously encountered, and I knew that only my friend's unparalleled powers of observation and deduction could hope to illuminate the darkness that surrounded Sir Reginald Blackwood's impossible death. The game, as Holmes would say, was most decidedly afoot. The journey to Grosvenor Square proved treacherous, our hansom cab sliding precariously along the ice-glazed cobblestones, while Holmes remained silent, his penetrating gaze fixed upon some invisible point beyond the frost-etched window. The bitter winds rattled our conveyance as we passed through the crystalline streets, where even the most mundane activities took on an air of struggle against the elements. As we rattled past a fishmonger's boy trudging against the wind, Holmes touched my sleeve with that characteristic gesture that preceded his casual demonstrations of deductive brilliance. "Note, Watson, the wet twine looped twice about his left wrist, the smear of scales upon the inside cuff, and the absence of a basket. He has just delivered to a household that insists on its catch before the market opens, evidently a kitchen whose mistress keeps a tight larder and a tighter clock." The boy turned into Upper Brook Street precisely as our hansom swung into Grosvenor Square, where the imposing facade of the Blackwood residence awaited us like a monument to Victorian prosperity shrouded in winter's grip. The house stood as a testament to wealth and respectability, its Portland stone facade rising 4 stories above the fashionable square. Even under the pallid winter sky, filtered through London's perpetual haze, the residence exuded an aura that made the bizarre circumstances of its master's death seem all the more incongruous. Constables stood guard at the entrance, their breath pluming white in the chill, their faces bearing the same bewildered gravity that had marked Lestrade's earlier demeanour. Henshaw, the butler, admitted us with the gaunt precision of a churchwarden, his dignified bearing unable to entirely conceal the obvious distress etched in the lines around his eyes. The hall struck me immediately as overheated, a damp exhalation hanging in the air, as though the house itself perspired from some internal fever. Even as I loosened my scarf, I became aware of a sharp, acrid tang reminiscent of a chemist's laboratory, an odour that seemed wholly out of place in such refined surroundings. Holmes's nostrils dilated with interest. "You have been cleaning with spirits?" he inquired of the servant. "No, sir," Henshaw replied, visibly startled by the question. Mrs. Cray would never permit such methods while the master worked. "We use vinegar of mornings in the passages, but not today, given the circumstances." "Just so," Holmes murmured, his keen gaze drifting methodically along the skirting boards, the brass hinges, and the breath-dimmed window at the corridor's end, cataloguing details with the precision of a scientific instrument. The study door bore the splintered wound of forcible entry, its oak panels violated by necessity. Within, the heat proved oppressive, despite the morning hour. The fire leaped hungrily in its grate, casting dancing shadows across walls lined with leather-bound volumes. A monstrous wetness had invaded the Turkish rug, spreading in dark tongues from the captain's chair positioned before the great mahogany desk. The very air seemed thick with moisture and that same chemical scent I had detected in the hallway. Sir Reginald himself remained where Lestrade had described, though the thawing process had relaxed the rigid posture the inspector had witnessed earlier. Traces of frost still glimmered faintly in the hollows of the carved armrests and clung to the nap of the chair's fabric like winter's reluctant retreat. The smell of damp wool and extinguished cold lingered in the corners, creating an atmosphere both stifling and somehow arctic. Holmes immediately set to work with that methodical precision that marked his approach to every investigation. He passed from grate to coal scuttle, examining the thermometer mounted upon the mantel before turning his attention to the window catches. At the desk blotter, he paused with sudden interest. "You observed this?" he asked Lestrade, lifting the blue paper to catch the firelight. "A blotter," the inspector replied with evident confusion. "I observe that it is blue." Holmes pressed a scrap of moistened paper against the surface, lifting an imperfect mirror of the last handwriting. "Iphigenia, hold. Demurrage, unacceptable. A.V. Most curious to commit such a refusal to paper and then blot so hastily." His eyes sharpened. "You mentioned Mr. Aldrich Vance dined here yesterday evening?" "Indeed, and their conversation grew quite heated," Henshaw interjected, his composure wavering slightly. Sir Reginald seemed unusually agitated throughout the evening. He had been corresponding with someone, several letters upon his desk that he gathered quickly when I entered with his brandy. The paper appeared foreign in manufacture, quite thick and cream-coloured, with an unusual watermark. One envelope bore a distinctive red wax seal featuring what appeared to be a coat of arms with some sort of bird. Holmes absorbed this information while continuing his examination. Dropping to one knee at the threshold, he captured some nearly invisible filament and pocketed it without comment. At the hearth, he parted the coals with tongs, exposing a white crust upon the blackened lumps. "Brine," he announced after touching a pinch to his tongue, a practice that never failed to concern me. "Common salt in abundance, and more besides. An industrious fire for a sleeping house, yet your scuttle is nearly empty, and the ashpan overfull." Moving to the desk drawers, he discovered a sheaf of invoices bearing the Blackwood Line's letter head for cold storage facilities at Tilbury, charges for ice, mechanical refrigeration, and brine pumps. Among them lay a receipt from a Lambeth firm for the hire of a portable cooling chest, dated a fortnight past. "The commerce of cold," Holmes murmured, his eyes alight with that familiar fire that indicated pieces of the puzzle beginning to align. "Inspector, we have before us not an impossible crime, but rather an elaborate deception designed to appear impossible. The question now becomes, who possessed both the means and the motive to orchestrate such an audacious charade?" The revelation of the ice storage receipts had illuminated a pathway through the seemingly impossible, yet Holmes remained absorbed in his methodical examination, his keen eyes cataloguing details that would escape ordinary observation. He knelt beside the chair where Sir Reginald's body remained, running his fingers along the Turkish rug's dampened fibres with the precision of a scientist studying specimens under glass. "Watson," he said without lifting his gaze, "your medical expertise may prove invaluable. Examine our victim's extremities carefully, the fingertips, earlobes, anywhere that genuine frostbite would manifest most readily." I approached the task with professional interest, grateful to apply my medical knowledge to this bewildering case. Sir Reginald's hands, now completely thawed, bore none of the characteristic blackening or tissue damage I would expect from true exposure to extreme cold. His complexion, though pale in death, showed no signs of the waxy, marble-like appearance that marked genuine hypothermia. Most tellingly, his clothing, while saturated from the melting process Lestrade had described, revealed no evidence of the deep ice crystals that would inevitably form from prolonged freezing. "Remarkable," I murmured, straightening from my examination. "The man shows none of the physiological markers of death by freezing. Whatever created the appearance of frost and ice was not the result of his body being subjected to genuinely Arctic conditions." Holmes nodded with evident satisfaction, as though my findings confirmed theories already crystallizing in his remarkable mind. "Precisely as I suspected. Now observe this." He directed my attention to barely perceptible scratches in the polished floorboards, leading from the doorway to the chair in two parallel lines. "Fresh marks, note how they cut through the accumulated dust and wax. Something substantial was moved here recently, something with metal runners or casters." Rising with fluid grace, he examined the doorframe itself, his magnifying lens revealing minute traces of the same white residue we had discovered in the fireplace. "Sea salt and sawdust," he pronounced, collecting the crystals in his envelope. "The marriage of preservation and transport known to every fishmonger and those who traffic in artificial cold." Before Lestrade could voice his growing frustration with these seemingly disparate clues, a commotion in the hallway arrested our attention. Henshaw's voice, raised in protest, was answered by a deeper, more commanding tone that brooked no contradiction. Moments later, a tall, imposing figure appeared in the doorway, a man whose bearing spoke of wealth and authority, despite the obvious distress etched upon his weathered features. "Mr. Aldrich Vance, I presume," Holmes said smoothly, his grey eyes immediately fixing upon the newcomer with that penetrating gaze that could extract confessions from the most recalcitrant souls. "Your timing proves most fortuitous. We were just discussing your dinner engagement with Sir Reginald yesterday evening." Vance's composure faltered momentarily, his pale blue eyes darting between Holmes and the scene of his partner's death. "I came as soon as I received word. Reginald and I may have had our differences, but he was my oldest friend. This is absolutely ghastly. They're saying he froze to death in his own study. It's utterly preposterous." "Indeed it is," Holmes agreed, his tone deceptively casual while his mind clearly assessed every nuance of Vance's demeanour. "Tell me, what was the nature of your disagreement last evening? The butler mentioned raised voices." Vance's jaw tightened perceptibly. "Business matters, nothing more. Reginald had developed some rather unconventional theories about our shipping operations. He was convinced someone was manipulating our cold storage facilities for purposes beyond legitimate cargo preservation. "And the vessel Iphigenia?" Holmes inquired with calculated precision. "I believe there was some dispute regarding demurrage charges." The blood drained from Vance's face so completely that I feared he might collapse, his hands trembling as he gripped the door frame. "How could you possibly know about that?" Holmes's expression remained impassive as he gestured toward the leather-bound blotter with theatrical precision. "The art of reading reversed impressions, Mr. Vance, proves invaluable in my profession. Your partner's final correspondence bears your initials quite clearly, along with what appears to be a rather emphatic refusal regarding the Iphigenia's extended harbour fees." Vance's composure crumbled visibly as he stepped deeper into the study, his pale eyes darting between the dampened chair and Holmes's unwavering gaze. Reginald had become increasingly paranoid about our operations. The Iphigenia is merely a refrigerated cargo vessel, nothing more sinister than mutton from Argentina and ice from Norway, but he'd convinced himself that someone was using our cold storage facilities for illegal purposes. "And what manner of illegal purposes did he suspect?" Holmes inquired, his tone maintaining that deceptive casualness that often preceded his most devastating revelations. "Smuggling, primarily," Vance admitted reluctantly. He believed someone was using our refrigerated holds to transport contraband, perhaps stolen goods that required preservation. He'd been conducting his own investigation, examining manifests, questioning dock workers, even hiring private agents to monitor our warehouses at Tilbury. He claimed to have discovered evidence of systematic theft, valuable items allegedly hidden within legitimate cargo shipments, then retrieved by accomplices before reaching their intended destinations. Lestrade straightened with interest. "And you opposed this investigation?" Vance's face flushed with indignation. "Because it was madness. Our business depends upon absolute discretion and reliability. Word of such an investigation would destroy our reputation among clients who trust us with their most valuable shipments. Besides, Reginald's evidence consisted of little more than suspicious discrepancies in inventory records and the testimony of dock workers who might easily have been mistaken." Holmes had resumed his methodical examination during this exchange, dropping to one knee beside the saturated rug. With his fingertip, he traced a faint rectangular indentation upon the nap where dampness had dried to a precise line. "Observe, Watson, this ghostly frame. It corresponds with the width of a compact chest, while those parallel scratches on the floorboards mark where metal runners bit into the polish." Rising with fluid grace, he examined the door frame, his magnifying lens revealing minute traces of the same white residue discovered in the fireplace. "Sea salt and sawdust," he pronounced, collecting the crystals carefully. "The marriage of preservation and transport known to every fishmonger and those who traffic in artificial cold." "Nevertheless," Holmes continued, fixing Vance with that penetrating stare, "your partner persisted in his concerns. He'd arranged to meet with representatives from Lloyd's of London this morning, hadn't he? Several of your clients had filed substantial insurance claims for cargo that arrived damaged or incomplete." Vance's shoulders sagged in defeat. Yes, he had. He believed these losses were not accidental, that they represented a pattern of deliberate theft. He threatened to proceed with or without my cooperation, claiming he possessed irrefutable proof from some anonymous informant who understood the intricacies of the trade. Before Holmes could pursue this revelation further, Henshaw appeared in the doorway, his dignified bearing unable to conceal mounting distress. "Forgive the interruption, sir, but I feel compelled to mention the delivery yesterday afternoon. A crate came through the Mews entrance, addressed to the master's study. When I returned from fetching assistance, Sir Reginald had directed the porter to bring it within, and dismissed us both locking the door behind him. "At what hour?" Holmes demanded sharply. "A little before 5, sir. It was bound with iron and banded with wire, smelling most unwholesome of sawdust and something chemical." Holmes nodded grimly, his nostrils flaring as he detected that persistent, acrid tang. "Ammonia, a refrigerant of the modern pattern, useful, potent, and in the wrong hands, theatrical." At that moment, Mrs. Cray appeared at the threshold, her weathered face bearing the determination of one accustomed to maintaining household routines despite extraordinary circumstances. "Begging your pardon, gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying decades of authority, "but I couldn't help overhearing your discussion. There's something you ought to know about the foreign gentleman who visited yesterday afternoon, the one with the peculiar accent and the most unusual request." Holmes's attention snapped toward her with the intensity of a hawk spotting prey, his grey eyes alight with renewed interest. "Pray continue, Mrs. Cray," Holmes said with that particular intensity that marked his pursuit of crucial evidence. "Every detail may prove significant to our understanding of this remarkable deception." The cook stepped forward, her weathered hands smoothing her apron with nervous precision. "He arrived just after 3 o'clock, sir, through the area door rather than the front entrance. Foreign he was, spoke English well enough, but with a peculiar accent I couldn't quite place. German, perhaps, or Dutch. Tall and lean, with greying whiskers and spectacles, but it was his hands that caught my notice most particularly." "His hands?" Holmes prompted, his pencil poised above his notebook. "Stained yellow about the fingertips, sir, as if from chemicals, and when he removed his gloves in the hallway, I observed curious scarring upon his knuckles, white lines that spoke of old burns or perhaps frostbite. He carried himself like a gentleman, well dressed in a dark overcoat, but there was something unsettling about his manner." Mrs. Cray produced a card from her apron pocket, a stiff rectangle of foreign manufacture with a faintly glazed surface. Holmes examined it carefully, holding it to the firelight. The printing read, "E. Vogel, Engineer, Frigorific Apparatus, Lambeth." In one corner, a tiny heraldic device was impressed in red wax, an eagle with wings displayed. "The same bird device Henshaw mentioned," I observed, recalling the butler's earlier testimony about the red wax seal. Holmes nodded with evident satisfaction. "Indeed, Watson, the threads begin to weave themselves into a recognizable pattern. Mrs. Cray, what was the nature of this gentleman's business with Sir Reginald?" "He claimed to represent some continental concern regarding irregularities in shipping arrangements, said he carried documents about missing cargo and insurance matters that required immediate attention. The master received him in the study, and within minutes their conversation grew quite heated. I could hear raised voices through the door, though I couldn't make out the specific words." "And his departure?" Holmes inquired, his attention now focused with laser-like intensity. "Most peculiar, sir. He left through the front door just as the crate arrived at the mews entrance. I observed him from the kitchen window, pausing to speak with the delivery men in what sounded like German. They seemed to recognize him, nodding respectfully before he disappeared into a waiting hansom at precisely 5:30. Holmes absorbed this intelligence while moving to examine the windowsill more closely. With his magnifying glass he discovered minute scratches upon the painted wood where metal had scraped against the surface. The window catch itself bore traces of recent manipulation, tiny metal filings that glinted in the firelight like silver dust. "The window was opened recently," he announced, despite the bitter cold and Sir Reginald's well-known aversion to draughts. "Someone required ventilation for purposes beyond mere comfort, specifically to disperse the acrid fumes of ammonia gas." Without further explanation, Holmes led us down to the kitchens, where the scullery proved chill as a tomb, despite the general warmth of the house. On the rim of the drain, a faint white crust had formed in a perfect ring, and the air held that unmistakable sharp reek we had detected throughout the house. He produced a narrow strip of paper from his pocket, dampened it with distilled water from a small vial, and touched it to the crystalline residue. "Alkaline, as I suspected," he murmured. From the flagstones he collected a pinch of damp sawdust peppered with greasy flecks, and from beneath the sink retrieved a hair-fine copper wire, kinked as if from repeated manipulation. The apparatus, Mrs. Cray observed, was a portable ammonia evaporator, Holmes explained, his grey eyes alight with the fire of discovery. Ammonia expanding within copper coils produces intense cold upon contact, sufficient to freeze a man solid within minutes if properly applied. The device was rinsed here to disperse the chemical residue, leaving these telltale traces. Vance, who had maintained rigid silence during this exchange, finally spoke. "You're suggesting that Sir Reginald was murdered by this Vogel character using some sort of freezing machine?" "I am suggesting," Holmes replied with deliberate precision, "that your partner was the victim of an elaborate deception designed to appear impossible. Whether Herr Vogel acted alone or in concert with others remains to be determined, but the evidence clearly indicates that Sir Reginald's apparent freezing was artificially induced through mechanical means." He turned to Lestrade with sudden decision. "Inspector, dispatch men immediately to the Lambeth address on this card. Have them detain anyone connected with frigorific apparatus or bearing the Eagle device. Time is of the essence. If my deductions prove correct, we are dealing with individuals who possess both the technical knowledge and criminal audacity to stage the impossible." "And the motive?" I asked, drawn by the quickened pulse that always accompanied Holmes's certainty. "Ah, Watson," he replied, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames like polished steel, "that lies hidden in those missing letters with their foreign paper and red wax seals. Sir Reginald discovered something that threatened powerful interests, something worth killing for in the most theatrical manner imaginable." While Lestrade dispatched his constables toward Lambeth with urgent instructions, Holmes returned his attention to the study's remaining secrets, his keen intellect now operating at that heightened pitch I had learned to recognize as the precursor to his most brilliant deductions. He positioned himself before Sir Reginald's desk blotter, producing a small mirror from his waistcoat to catch the firelight across its surface at various angles. "The art of reading reversed impressions, Watson, reveals far more than our initial examination suggested," he murmured, his grey eyes tracing the ghostly indentations left by hurried correspondence. "Observe these overlapping patterns, 3 distinct sessions of writing, each more agitated than the last. Our victim was conducting an extensive exchange with someone who demanded immediate and detailed responses. Under the mirror's reflection, fragments of text emerged with startling clarity. Norwegian ice consignment diverted, Antwerp diamonds unaccounted, and most significantly, Vogel confirms apparatus ready." The progression of the writing revealed Sir Reginald's growing alarm as he documented what appeared to be a systematic catalogue of shipping irregularities, each entry more damning than the last. "These correspond to the insurance claims you mentioned," Holmes observed to Vance, who had grown increasingly pale during our examination. "Your partner was not merely investigating random thefts, he was documenting a sophisticated conspiracy that used your refrigerated facilities as a base of operations." Before Vance could respond, rapid footsteps upon the stairs announced Lestrade's return, his face bearing the grim satisfaction of confirmed suspicions. "The Lambeth address, Holmes. We found it abandoned, cleared out in obvious haste, but the landlady provided valuable intelligence. She described a young gentleman caller who visited Vogel repeatedly, brown hair, clean-shaven, wearing a gold anchor pin, The description matches young Pemberton perfectly." Holmes nodded with evident satisfaction. So our secretary was more than Sir Reginald's employee. He was the vital link between the victim and his supposed informant. But observe this curious detail. He indicated a section of the blotter where the impressions showed a different hand entirely. Two distinct writing styles appear in these final communications. Vogel was not merely providing information, he was receiving detailed instructions. At that moment, a constable burst through the doorway, his face flushed with urgency. "Inspector's compliments, sir, but there's been a development at Tilbury. One of the Blackwood Line's main refrigeration buildings is ablaze, started not an hour past. The dockmaster reports it began in the records office and spread rapidly despite the dampness." The implication struck us all simultaneously. Holmes's expression hardened into that mask of controlled fury I had witnessed only when confronting the most calculating criminals. "They are eliminating evidence with characteristic thoroughness," he declared. "The fire is no accident. It represents a coordinated effort to destroy all traces of their operations." Vance stepped forward, his composure finally cracking entirely. "Holmes, I must confess something that may prove relevant. 3 weeks ago, Pemberton approached me privately, claiming he had discovered irregularities in our shipping manifests. He suggested that someone within our organization was systematically diverting valuable cargo during the refrigeration process. I dismissed his concerns as the overactive imagination of an ambitious clerk." "And yet you said nothing of this to Sir Reginald?" Holmes inquired, his tone carrying that dangerous edge that preceded his most devastating revelations. "Pemberton specifically requested that I keep his suspicions confidential until he could gather more substantial proof. He claimed to have identified a contact within the criminal organization, someone willing to provide detailed information about their methods in exchange for immunity from prosecution." Holmes absorbed this intelligence while moving to examine the fireplace more closely. Among the ashes, he discovered several partially burned fragments of thick, cream-colored paper bearing traces of red wax. "The foreign correspondence," he announced grimly. "Destroyed after our victim's death, but before our arrival. Someone with intimate knowledge of this house's layout removed the evidence while we were occupied elsewhere." The sound of hoofbeats in the square drew our attention to the window, where a messenger on horseback was dismounting with obvious urgency. Within moments, Henshaw appeared with a telegram bearing the Blackwood Line's letterhead. "For Mr. Vance, sir," the butler announced, his dignified composure unable to conceal mounting anxiety. Vance tore open the yellow envelope, his hands trembling as he read its contents. "The entire Tilbury facility is lost," he whispered. "All records, all inventory, all evidence of our operations consumed by flames that the fire brigade cannot contain." Holmes fixed him with that penetrating stare that could extract confessions from the most recalcitrant souls. "Then we must work with what remains, Mr. Vance. The criminals may have destroyed the physical evidence, but they cannot eliminate the human element. Someone orchestrated this elaborate deception, and that someone has made a fatal error in underestimating both the reach of justice and the persistence of those who serve it." The telegram's devastating news had scarcely settled when Holmes began pacing with that restless energy that marked his most concentrated thinking. "The destruction of evidence suggests our adversaries possessed detailed knowledge of investigative procedures. They anticipated exactly which documents would prove most damaging to their enterprise. Watson, this transforms our approach entirely. We must now rely upon the more ephemeral, yet equally damning evidence of human motive and interaction." Without pause, he turned to Henshaw with renewed urgency. "The crate that arrived by the Mews, who received it, and by what carrier?" "The porter engaged for heavy work, sir, James Pike from Bardell & Co. Inn out of Marylebone Lane. He brought it on a handcart with iron wheels bound with wire and smelling most unwholesome of sawdust and something chemical. "To the Mews," Holmes declared, and we descended through the service passage into the shadowed yard where the stones still gleamed with a faint, oily sheen. Holmes crouched, touching a knuckle to the dampness. "Brine again, but observe these twin arcs, Watson. Iron wheels with a distinctive nick in the left rim. The handcart stood precisely here." He traced with his walking stick 2 parallel grooves leading to the back steps, pausing to extract a minute scarlet flake from a crack in the stone. Sealing wax of the same foreign manufacture we discovered earlier. From a splinter of wood he plucked a tan fibre no thicker than a hair. Jute, from coarse sacking, the very twin of the filament I discovered in the study doorway. The chest was swaddled in sacking salt and sawdust, brought indoors through these unregarded channels of service. Rising with fluid grace, Holmes fixed Vance with that penetrating stare. "Your partnership with Sir Reginald extended beyond domestic shipping, did it not? The Blackwood line served as a British terminus for an international network of refrigerated transport." Vance nodded reluctantly, his pallor deepening. "Our continental connections were essential. Hamburg, Antwerp, Amsterdam. Reginald had developed relationships throughout Northern Europe, particularly those specializing in high-value cargo requiring temperature-controlled storage. Art objects, rare manuscripts, precious stones, items commanding premium rates for secure transport. And these relationships provided perfect cover for systematic theft," Holmes concluded grimly. "Valuable items diverted during refrigeration, replaced with worthless substitutes, redistributed through accomplice networks before deception was discovered. The insurance claims processed months later, by which time stolen goods had vanished into private collections." At that moment, as if summoned by our discussion, the sound of a key turning in the front door echoed through the house. Light footsteps ascended toward the study, and young Pemberton appeared in the doorway, his usually composed demeanor showing considerable strain. "Mr. Vance," he began, removing his hat with trembling hands, "I came as soon as I heard the terrible news. Sir Reginald was such a kind employer, and this ghastly business about freezing to death, it defies all comprehension." Holmes fixed him with that stare that could extract confessions from the most recalcitrant souls. "Indeed it does, Mr. Pemberton. Perhaps you might enlighten us regarding your role in this elaborate deception. Your supposed discovery of irregularities was merely a pretext to manipulate both partners while orchestrating theft from within." The young man's composure crumbled visibly, his face draining of colour as he gripped the doorframe. "I don't understand what you're implying. My relationship with Sir Reginald was purely professional." "Was it?" Holmes inquired with deceptive mildness. "Then perhaps you can explain why your fingers bear the telltale scarring of chemical burns, the same copper salt residue we discovered throughout this house, or why the records office at Tilbury burst into flames at precisely the moment our investigation focused upon the international scope of this conspiracy." Pemberton's hands began shaking uncontrollably as Holmes continued his relentless exposition. "You were not Sir Reginald's ally in exposing the conspiracy. You were its architect within the organization. You fed his suspicions back to the very individuals he sought to investigate, lulling him into false security while arranging his elimination." The secretary's carefully constructed facade finally collapsed entirely. "You cannot prove any of this," he whispered, though his voice carried no conviction. Holmes smiled grimly, producing from his waistcoat the distinctive anchor pin we had discovered earlier. "On the contrary, Mr. Pemberton, the evidence of your treachery lies scattered throughout this house like breadcrumbs leading to a particularly dark fairy tale, The question now becomes, will you cooperate in exposing your masters, or shall we allow them to dispose of you as they did Sir Reginald? The stark reality of Holmes's accusation struck Pemberton with the force of a physical blow, his carefully maintained composure crumbling like ancient parchment exposed to flame. The young secretary staggered backward, his face draining of all colour, as he gripped the doorframe with trembling fingers. For a long moment, the only sounds in the study were the crackling of the fire and the distant rumble of London's eternal traffic, while Holmes maintained that penetrating stare that had broken countless criminals before. "They promised it would be bloodless," Pemberton whispered finally, his voice barely audible above the winter wind rattling the frost-etched windows. "Vogel assured me that Sir Reginald would merely be rendered unconscious long enough for us to retrieve the incriminating documents and disappear. The freezing apparatus was supposed to simulate death temporarily, creating confusion while we escaped with the evidence." Holmes remained motionless, his grey eyes fixed upon the young man with that terrible intensity that seemed to pierce through flesh and bone to examine the very soul beneath. "Yet you participated willingly in this elaborate deception, knowing full well that your employer's life hung in the balance." Pemberton collapsed into the nearest chair, burying his face in his hands as the weight of his guilt became unbearable. When he finally raised his eyes, they held the hollow desperation of a man who had glimpsed his own destruction and found it wanting. "He approached me 6 months ago," he began, his voice gaining strength as the relief of confession overcame his terror. "Emil Vogel, claiming to represent continental investors interested in expanding refrigerated shipping operations throughout Northern Europe." "And you believe this fiction?" Holmes inquired with that deceptive mildness that often preceded his most devastating revelations. "At first, yes," Pemberton admitted miserably. He spoke eloquently of legitimate business opportunities, substantial commissions for facilitating introductions between European clients and British carriers. The payments were generous, far exceeding my secretary's wages, and the requests seemed harmless enough. Shipping schedules, cargo manifests, client preferences, information that any competent businessman might reasonably require. Holmes began his characteristic pacing, his hands clasped behind his back as he absorbed this intelligence. Until the requests became more specific, more intrusive. "When did you realize the true nature of Vogel's enterprise?" "Gradually, almost imperceptibly," Pemberton continued, his hands trembling as he spoke. "The refrigerated holds provided perfect concealment for their operations. Valuable items could be removed during the cooling process, replaced with worthless substitutes, and redistributed before anyone noticed the deception. Vogel called it the frigorific ring, a network of accomplices throughout Northern Europe who specialized in high-value theft disguised as shipping irregularities." Lestrade stepped forward with professional interest, his notebook ready to capture every detail of this extraordinary confession. "And Sir Reginald's growing suspicions threatened this entire operation?" "He was becoming increasingly methodical in his investigations," Pemberton confirmed, his voice growing stronger as the burden of secrecy lifted from his shoulders. 3 weeks ago, he discovered significant discrepancies in the Antwerp manifests, diamonds that arrived as paste, paintings that proved to be clever forgeries, manuscripts that crumbled to dust when removed from their protective wrappings. He began conducting surprise inspections of the Tilbury facilities, questioning dock workers personally, examining cargo with the thoroughness of a customs inspector. Holmes paused in his pacing, fixing the young man with renewed intensity. "The meeting with Lloyd's of London was scheduled for this morning, was it not? Sir Reginald intended to present his findings to the insurance investigators." "Yes," Pemberton whispered. He had gathered substantial documentation, witness statements, physical evidence of the substitutions. He was determined to expose the entire network, regardless of the consequences to the Blackwood Line's reputation or his own financial interests. So you arranged his final meeting with Vogel under the pretense of providing additional information about the conspiracy, Holmes concluded grimly. Instead, your German accomplice brought the means of his destruction disguised as evidence of criminal activity. The secretary's face crumpled with what appeared to be genuine remorse. Vogel insisted it was our only option. He claimed Sir Reginald had become too dangerous, too persistent in his investigations. The apparatus was supposed to render him unconscious temporarily, allowing us to retrieve the incriminating documents and stage his death as a heart attack brought on by the shock of discovering the theft. But something went catastrophically wrong, I observed, my medical training recognizing the signs of a plan that had spiraled beyond its creator's control. Pemberton nodded desperately, tears streaming down his face. Sir Reginald was stronger than anticipated, more resistant to the effects of the ammonia gas. He struggled against the apparatus, tried to reach the door, knocked over furniture in his efforts to escape. The exposure lasted far longer than Vogel had calculated, and by the time we realized the severity of his condition, the freezing process had progressed beyond any hope of reversal. Holmes's expression hardened into that mask of controlled fury I had witnessed only when confronting the most calculating criminals. Yet you proceeded to stage the scene with theatrical precision, arranging his body in the chair, destroying the correspondence, removing all traces of the apparatus except those necessary to maintain the illusion of an impossible death. Vogel was obsessed with the theatrical aspects, Pemberton pleaded, as though this might somehow mitigate his guilt. He insisted that the authorities would never believe the truth, that we would be charged with murder regardless of our original intentions. The impossible nature of the death would focus attention on the mystery rather than the motive, buying us time to escape while Scotland Yard puzzled over the seeming violation of natural law. At that moment, the sound of rapid footsteps upon the stairs announced another arrival. Mrs. Hudson appeared in the doorway, her usually composed demeanour showing considerable agitation. "Forgive the intrusion, gentlemen, but there's a telegram just arrived from Dover. Most urgent, according to the messenger." Holmes accepted the yellow envelope with characteristic calm, though I detected a slight quickening in his movements as he tore it open. His eyes scanned the contents rapidly, and I observed the familiar tightening around his mouth that indicated significant developments. "Inspector Lestrade," he announced with grim satisfaction, "it appears our net begins to close around the remaining members of this international conspiracy. The Dover authorities report suspicious activity at the packet terminal. A foreign gentleman matching Vogel's description was observed attempting to board the evening steamer for Calais, carrying what appeared to be valuable cargo in a specially designed travelling case." The urgency of the Dover telegram galvanized our small party into immediate action, though Holmes maintained that characteristic calm that marked his most critical moments. Within minutes, Lestrade had dispatched additional constables to secure the scene, while Holmes gathered his travelling kit with methodical precision, selecting specific chemical apparatus that suggested he anticipated more than a simple arrest. "Inspector," Holmes commanded as we prepared to depart, "ensure that Pemberton remains under protective custody. His testimony will prove crucial, but more importantly, his life may be in considerable danger once word of Vogel's capture reaches the remaining conspirators." He fixed Vance with that penetrating stare. "You, sir, will accompany us to Dover. Your intimate knowledge of the shipping operations may prove invaluable in understanding exactly what Vogel attempts to smuggle from our shores. The journey to Dover aboard the Special Express proved illuminating in ways I had not anticipated. Holmes spent the first portion sketching detailed diagrams of Dover's maritime facilities, consulting his pocket watch repeatedly and calculating what he termed the mathematics of pursuit. As the winter landscape blurred past our frost-etched windows, he began to reveal the broader implications of our investigation. "Watson," he said, producing the Foreign Office telegram from his waistcoat, "this case extends far beyond the murder of Sir Reginald Blackwood. We are confronting an international conspiracy that has operated with impunity for over 18 months, using Britain's legitimate shipping infrastructure as a conduit for systematic theft throughout Northern Europe." He spread several documents across our compartment table, including the shipping manifests we had discovered earlier and correspondence bearing various continental postmarks. The pattern becomes clear when examined systematically. Art objects disappearing from Amsterdam galleries, jewellery vanishing from Hamburg collections, rare manuscripts stolen from Brussels libraries, all items requiring specialised storage and transport conditions that only refrigerated shipping could provide. Vance, who had maintained rigid silence since our departure, finally spoke with obvious distress. "You're suggesting that our entire operation has been compromised from within? That someone with executive authority has been facilitating these thefts?" Holmes's grey eyes reflected the dancing flames of our compartment's small heating lamp as he fixed Vance with renewed intensity. "I am suggesting, Mr. Vance, that the conspiracy required coordination at the highest levels of the Blackwood line. Random theft could never achieve the precision and scope that Sir Reginald discovered in his investigations." Before Vance could respond, our train began its descent toward the Channel coast, where Dover's white cliffs emerged from the winter haze like ancient sentinels guarding Britain's shores. The packet steamer, Maid of Kent, was already visible in the harbour, her funnel belching smoke into the twilight sky as she prepared for the evening crossing to Calais. Upon our arrival at Dover's bustling terminal, we were met by Inspector Bradshaw of the local constabulary, whose weathered face bore the satisfaction of a successful operation. "We've detained your German gentleman, Mr. Holmes, though not without considerable difficulty. He attempted to board using forged documentation, carrying a most unusual travelling case that he insisted contained delicate scientific instruments." Holmes nodded with evident satisfaction. "And the case itself?" "Secured in the customs house under guard, sir. Most peculiar construction, reinforced leather with brass fittings and what appears to be some sort of cooling apparatus built into the lining. The whole thing reeks of that sharp chemical smell you mentioned in your telegram." "Ammonia," Holmes confirmed grimly. "The very substance used to create the illusion of Sir Reginald's impossible freezing. Lead us to this evidence, Inspector. I suspect we shall find more than scientific instruments within Herr Vogel's carefully constructed deception." The Customs House examination proved even more revealing than Holmes had anticipated. The travelling case, when opened under proper ventilation, contained not only a sophisticated portable refrigeration apparatus, but also a collection of valuable items that clearly did not belong to any legitimate traveller. Antwerp diamonds nestled in specially designed cooling chambers, alongside rare manuscripts wrapped in chemically treated cloth, and several small paintings that bore the distinctive marks of recent removal from their frames. "The fruits of 18 months' systematic theft," Holmes observed, examining each item with his magnifying glass. "Note the precision of the storage methods, Watson. Each piece has been preserved with scientific accuracy, maintained at precise temperatures to prevent deterioration during transport." At that moment, Bradshaw returned with news that sent a chill through our assembled group. "The prisoner is asking to speak with you personally, Mr. Holmes. Claims he has information about what he calls the British architect of the entire operation. says he'll only discuss it with the famous detective who exposed his impossible crime. Holmes's expression hardened into that mask of controlled determination I had witnessed only when confronting the most calculating criminals. "Very well, Inspector. Let us hear what Herr Vogel has to say about his mysterious British partner. But maintain your guards. A man capable of orchestrating Sir Reginald's theatrical murder is capable of any deception." The interview room in Dover's police station was stark and cold, illuminated only by a single gas lamp that cast dancing shadows across the whitewashed walls. Emil Vogel sat rigidly upright in his chair, his steel-rimmed spectacles reflecting the flickering light as he regarded Holmes with what appeared to be grudging professional respect. "So," he said in accented but precise English, "the famous Sherlock Holmes has unravelled my impossible thaw. I confess myself impressed by the speed of your deductions." Holmes remained standing, his tall frame silhouetted against the lamp's glow as he fixed the prisoner with that penetrating stare. "Your theatrical methods were ingenious, Herr Vogel, but ultimately flawed. The laws of physics cannot be suspended, merely manipulated by those who understand them sufficiently." Vogel's thin lips curved in what might have been a smile. "Indeed, but you have apprehended only the mechanism, Mr. Holmes. The mind that conceived the entire operation remains beyond your reach." "Does it?" Holmes inquired with deceptive mildness. "Perhaps you would care to enlighten us regarding this mysterious mastermind." For a long moment, Vogel studied Holmes's face as though weighing the consequences of revelation against the certainty of his own destruction. Finally, he spoke with the calm precision of a man who had accepted his fate. "The British partner possesses something far more valuable than my technical expertise, absolute authority within the legitimate shipping structure. Someone whose word is never questioned by subordinates, whose access to manifests and documentation is complete and unmonitored." Holmes nodded grimly, his grey eyes reflecting the dancing flame like polished steel. "Someone who could ensure that stolen continental goods entered Britain through seemingly legitimate channels while filing insurance claims for the losses that had actually been orchestrated thefts." "Precisely," Vogel confirmed, "a double profit that made even the considerable risks worthwhile. But I warn you, Mr. Holmes, you have captured the engineer, not the architect. The true criminal possesses resources and connections that extend far beyond a single shipping line." At that moment, the sound of urgent footsteps in the corridor announced another arrival. The door burst open to reveal Lestrade, his face flushed with the exertion of rapid travel and the satisfaction of confirmed suspicions. "Holmes!" he gasped. "We've had developments in London. The fire at Tilbury was no accident. We've found evidence of systematic document destruction dating back months. And more significantly, we've discovered who ordered the destruction." Holmes turned from Vogel with that terrible certainty that marked his most devastating revelations. "Mr. Aldrich Vance, I presume?" "Indeed," Lestrade confirmed grimly. "The man fled Grosvenor Square within an hour of our departure, but not before attempting to destroy additional evidence in Sir Reginald's study. We have him in custody, and his confession promises to illuminate the full scope of this international conspiracy." Holmes regarded Vogel with something approaching satisfaction. "It appears, Herr Vogel, that your architect has proven less resourceful than anticipated. The web of deception you helped weave has finally ensnared its principal spinner." The German engineer's composure finally cracked, his shoulders sagging as the full implications of his situation became clear. "Then it is finished," he whispered. "The frigorific ring dies with its creators." "Justice," Holmes replied with quiet finality, "has a way of restoring the natural order, even when faced with the most unnatural crimes." The journey back to London through the bitter February night proved contemplative, our railway carriage filled with the weight of revelations that had transformed an impossible mystery into a comprehensible, if elaborate, criminal conspiracy. Holmes remained absorbed in his notes, occasionally glancing at the darkness beyond our frost-etched windows as he assembled the final pieces of evidence that would complete our understanding of Sir Reginald Blackwood's theatrical murder. Upon our arrival at Scotland Yard, we found Aldrich Vance awaiting us in a stark interview room, his once commanding presence reduced to the hollow shell of a man who had glimpsed his own destruction. He rose as we entered, attempting to maintain some vestige of his former authority, yet his eyes held the desperate calculation of a cornered animal seeking any possible escape. "Gentlemen," he began with forced composure, "I trust you realize the gravity of falsely accusing a respected businessman of such heinous crimes. I am prepared to assist in your investigation, but I will not tolerate—" Holmes raised his hand with that characteristic gesture that brooked no interruption. "Mr. Vance, we shall proceed methodically, as befits a case of such elaborate construction. Permit me to present the evidence in 4 distinct movements, each building upon the last, until the complete symphony of your deception stands revealed." He began pacing with that familiar rhythm that marked his most devastating expositions. First, the matter of motive. Sir Reginald had resolved to expose systematic theft operating through your refrigerated shipping facilities. His meeting with Lloyd's of London, scheduled for this very morning, would have presented irrefutable documentation of insurance fraud spanning 18 months, the Iphigenia's extended demurrage, which you had authorized repeatedly, despite your partner's objections, provided the precise windows your continental accomplices required for their temperature-sensitive operations. Vance's composure flickered momentarily, but he maintained his silence as Holmes continued with relentless precision. Second, the question of means. Emile Vogel supplied the technical apparatus, but it was your executive authority that admitted him to Grosvenor Square under the pretense of legitimate business consultation. The portable cooling chest, hired from the Lambeth firm and billed to a Blackwood subsidiary account, required authorization from one of only 2 officers. Sir Reginald, who deplored unnecessary expenditure, would never have approved such a requisition. The signature, therefore, must be yours. Holmes produced the hiring receipt from his pocket, its damning evidence clear even in the gaslight's flickering illumination. The apparatus itself was ingeniously designed, ammonia expansion coils capable of producing intense artificial cold within minutes, combined with salt and sawdust to enhance the freezing effect and create the theatrical spectacle you required. Third, Holmes continued, his grey eyes now alight with that terrible certainty that marked his most triumphant moments, the seemingly impossible locked room. You relied upon a common misconception that has misled investigators for centuries. The key discovered in Sir Reginald's pocket suggested he had secured himself within his study, yet your warded lock yields readily to a skeleton key or carefully filed duplicate. From his waistcoat, Holmes produced a small metal implement bearing fresh file marks. Recovered from your desk at the Blackwood offices, along with correspondence bearing the same thick foreign paper and red eagle seal we discovered burned in Sir Reginald's fireplace. You locked the door from the corridor after staging the scene, then departed through the Mews entrance with Vogel and the incriminating apparatus, leaving young Pemberton to discover the impossible death and summon the authorities. I stepped forward to deliver my medical testimony, as Holmes had indicated with that subtle gesture I had learned to recognize. Sir Reginald did not perish from natural exposure to extreme cold, I stated with professional certainty. His tissues show none of the characteristic damage associated with genuine hypothermia or frostbite. he succumbed to artificial refrigeration produced by ammonia expansion, a violent, rapid process that created the illusion of natural freezing while leaving the room's ambient temperature unchanged. Holmes nodded with satisfaction before delivering his final, devastating blow. Fourth, the human element that made your elaborate deception possible. Young Pemberton, initially an unwitting tool in your conspiracy, had been carefully cultivated over months. You fed him selected irregularities in the shipping records, making him feel important while ensuring his investigations never approached the truth. The gold anchor pin he wore was a token from Vogel, marking him as a trusted informant within what he believed was a legitimate effort to expose criminal activity. The weight of this systematic exposition finally broke Vance's remaining composure. His shoulders sagged as the full hopelessness of his situation became undeniable. "It was never supposed to end in death," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the distant sounds of London's eternal traffic. Vogel assured me the apparatus would merely render Reginald unconscious long enough for us to retrieve the incriminating documents and stage his demise as a natural heart attack. Yet you proceeded with the theatrical staging even when your partner's condition proved far more serious than anticipated, Holmes observed with cold precision. The impossible thaw was designed to perplex Scotland Yard with an insoluble paradox, buying you precious time to escape while the authorities puzzled over the apparent violation of natural law. Vance lifted his head with a final spark of defiance. He would have destroyed everything we had built, years of reputation, legitimate business relationships, the trust of clients throughout Europe. The board of directors would have held me personally responsible for the scandal, regardless of my actual involvement in the thefts. "Not everything, Mr. Vance," Holmes replied with quiet finality. "Only those enterprises built upon systematic deception and the exploitation of others' trust. You confused your personal ledger with moral arithmetic, valuing profit above principle and theatrical misdirection above honest confession." Lestrade stepped forward with professional satisfaction. "Aldrich Vance, I am arresting you on charges of conspiracy, insurance fraud, arson, and the murder of Sir Reginald Blackwood. You will be held pending trial where your full confession will be required to illuminate the complete scope of this international conspiracy." As the door closed upon the prisoner, Holmes turned to me with an expression that mingled satisfaction with the weariness that always followed his most complex cases. "You see, Watson, the solution lay not in miracles but in mechanics, ammonia coils, duplicate keys, and the patient arithmetic of systematic fraud. When criminals clothe their enterprises in the garments of the impossible, it is usually to conceal the mundane seams of ordinary greed and desperation." "Yet without your remarkable ability to perceive those seams," I replied, "the illusion might have endured indefinitely, leaving justice forever frustrated by apparent impossibility." Holmes shrugged with characteristic modesty, though I detected the quiet satisfaction of a puzzle definitively solved. A matter of systematic observation, Watson, combined with the determination to follow evidence wherever it leads, regardless of how extraordinary the initial circumstances may appear. In the weeks that followed, the legal proceedings confirmed every detail of Holmes's brilliant deduction. The frigorific ring, as the continental press dubbed it, had operated throughout Northern Europe for nearly 2 years, systematically targeting private collections, galleries, and museums whose valuable contents required specialized storage during transport. The double profit, first from theft, then from fraudulent insurance claims, had generated enormous wealth for a network of accomplices stretching from Hamburg to Brussels. Pemberton, whose genuine remorse and cooperation with the authorities earned him a more lenient sentence, provided crucial testimony that illuminated the gradual process by which ordinary ambition had been transformed into criminal complicity. His case served as a sobering reminder that even the most well-intentioned individuals could become unwitting tools in the hands of sufficiently calculating criminals. The case of the corpse that thawed too soon ultimately took its place among Holmes's most celebrated investigations, not merely for the ingenuity required to solve an apparently impossible crime, but for the systematic methodology that transformed theatrical misdirection into comprehensible criminal logic. As I recorded the final details in my journal that evening, with Holmes already absorbed in the morning papers and the promise of new mysteries, I reflected upon the profound satisfaction that comes from witnessing justice restored through the application of reason, observation, and unwavering moral purpose. The impossible, as Holmes had demonstrated once again, was merely the improbable clothed in deliberate deception, and no deception, however elaborate, could long withstand the patient scrutiny of a truly analytical mind. The fire in our Baker Street hearth had settled to glowing embers by the time Holmes completed his final notes on the Blackwood case, the scratching of his pen providing a rhythmic counterpoint to the winter wind that continued to rattle our windows 3 days after our return from Dover. I sat in my customary chair, reflecting upon the extraordinary chain of deductions that had transformed an impossible mystery into a comprehensible criminal conspiracy, when Holmes suddenly set down his pen and fixed me with that penetrating gaze that often preceded his most philosophical observations. "You know, Watson," he began, reaching for his pipe with characteristic deliberation, "this case has illuminated a principle that extends far beyond the mechanics of artificial refrigeration or the psychology of systematic theft. The criminals sought to exploit our fundamental assumptions about the nature of physical reality itself, the belief that certain phenomena lie beyond the realm of human manipulation." A knock at our door interrupted his reflection, and Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing the Morning Post, along with a telegram that Holmes examined with immediate interest. "From Inspector Lestrade," he announced, scanning the yellow paper. "The Continental authorities have successfully dismantled the remaining elements of the frigorific ring. 7 arrests in Hamburg, 5 in Amsterdam, 3 in Brussels. The recovered stolen goods include artifacts worth over £200,000, along with detailed records that will enable the restoration of items to their rightful owners." He set the telegram aside with evident satisfaction before continuing. "The legal proceedings have concluded as well. Vance received life imprisonment for murder and conspiracy, while Vogel was sentenced to 20 years for his technical expertise in service of crime. The courts recognized the systematic nature of their enterprise. This was no crime of passion, but a calculated assault upon the foundations of legitimate commerce." The arrival of our afternoon visitor provided a fitting conclusion to these reflections. Young Pemberton appeared at our threshold, his face bearing the hollow gravity of one who had glimpsed the consequences of moral compromise, yet retained sufficient character to seek redemption. Holmes received him with characteristic courtesy, gesturing toward the chair beside our fire. "Mr. Pemberton," he began with uncharacteristic gentleness, "I trust your legal proceedings have concluded satisfactorily." 2 years imprisonment with the possibility of early release for continued cooperation," Pemberton replied, his voice carrying the weight of genuine remorse. "More lenient than I deserved, given my role in Sir Reginald's death. I came to express my gratitude for your intervention on my behalf, and to ask a question that has haunted me since Dover." Holmes inclined his head with that gesture that invited confidence. "How did you know?" Pemberton continued, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "From the very beginning you seemed to understand not merely the mechanics of the crime, but the psychology that made it possible." Holmes considered this question with the seriousness it deserved, his grey eyes reflecting decades of experience in the study of human nature. The evidence of your involvement lay scattered throughout the investigation like breadcrumbs leading to an inevitable conclusion. Your detailed knowledge of shipping procedures, your convenient absence during the critical evening, your immediate availability when the body was discovered, each element suggested coordination rather than coincidence. He paused to relight his pipe before continuing, but, more significantly, your emotional responses revealed the burden of guilty knowledge. Genuine surprise produces different physiological manifestations than feigned shock. Your pallor when I mentioned the Iphigenia, your trembling when confronted with the anchor pin, these suggested a man struggling with complicity rather than confronting unexpected revelation. Pemberton absorbed this analysis with evident gravity. I told myself I was serving justice by helping to expose the conspiracy. Even when the methods became questionable, I convinced myself that the ultimate goal justified the deception. A dangerous philosophy, Holmes observed with quiet firmness, that has led countless individuals down the path from minor compromise to major criminality. The moment we begin to measure justice by our personal convenience rather than universal principle, we surrender the very foundation upon which civilization depends. As our visitor departed, carrying with him the weight of hard-earned wisdom, Holmes returned to his contemplation of the dying fire. The winter evening had settled over London like a familiar blanket, bringing with it that peculiar peace that follows the successful resolution of a complex investigation. "The true mystery, Watson," he said finally, his voice carrying that tone of quiet satisfaction I had learned to associate with his most successful cases, was never how Sir Reginald froze in a heated room. The true mystery was how ordinary human beings allowed legitimate ambition to transform into criminal conspiracy. That transformation follows laws as predictable as those governing thermodynamics, yet it remains endlessly fascinating in its individual manifestations. I nodded thoughtfully, understanding that Holmes had identified the deeper significance of our recent adventure. The corpse that thawed too soon was merely the symptom. The disease was the gradual corruption of moral judgment by the promise of easy profit. "Exactly so," Holmes replied, settling back into his chair with evident contentment. "And like all diseases, it yields to proper diagnosis and systematic treatment, provided one has the patience to examine symptoms carefully and the determination to follow evidence wherever it leads." The case of Sir Reginald Blackwood had concluded with that rare satisfaction that comes from witnessing justice restored through the application of reason and unwavering moral principle. As I prepared my final notes for publication, I reflected upon the profound truth that Holmes had illuminated, that no deception, however elaborate or seemingly impossible, could long withstand the patient scrutiny of a mind committed to discovering truth rather than confirming comfortable assumptions. The fire settled to its final embers as London prepared for another winter night, carrying with it the eternal promise that somewhere in the city's labyrinthine streets new mysteries awaited the attention of those bold enough to confront the impossible with the simple tools of logic, observation, and unwavering dedication to justice. The game, as Holmes would undoubtedly say when our next adventure beckoned, would always be afoot.